evening. It has been quite a while since I have spoken on some of the major topics that affect us as a people, as a race, and also some of the global events that are happening right now. For a moment, it appeared like America and Russia would go to war in Syria. And one of the interesting observations that most Pan-Africanists have been making is that the nations that attacked Africa or led to the destruction of Africa are themselves either being destroyed or have been destroyed, including nations that took a significant part of Africa. The Assyrians invaded Africa, invaded Egypt, and led to the destruction of most of the temples, and killed a lot of people and sold a lot of African people as slaves. Babylonians, which is present today Iraq, it did the same. Assyrians, at the time of Ashurbanipal, and the Babylonians, also invaded Africa. The Romans, invaded North Africa and ruled North Africa for a long time. But the Roman Empire is no more. The Assyrian Empire is really struggling, and if it wasn't for the Russian bear, it would be destroyed. So is Babylonia, really, smashed. The Greeks, who invaded Africa and, ruled Africa for some time, have also had their own troubles. Spain is gone, Portugal is gone. Now, at the heart of the destruction of these empires, or the disappearance of these empires, is almost hidden laws, of global power. And these hidden laws of global power, stipulate that after a protracted period of time, it's mainly 50 years, sometimes 100 years, there is a change where power shifts. And it shifts from one region to another, from one state to another. And at the heart of that shift is a war. In ancient time, it used to be 500 years. Every 500 years, you'd get a new empire. 500 years, you'd get a new empire. But in recent history, it became 50 years. I suppose nature removed a zero from 500 and it became 50 years. So let me give an example. Of course, Portugal was one of the, after European so-called Dark Ages, Dark Ages, Spain and Portugal are ruled by Africans of the Moors. They ruled Spain and Portugal from 711 up to 1503. That is 800 years. Now, after that 800 years, most of the empires that would come, or most of the global powers that would come, would not rule for that period of time. They would not rule for 500 years. They would not rule for they'd rule for 50, 60 years. So Portugal's rule, after Portugal, Isabel of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, Spanish rule successfully chase away the Africans. They go and become a major power, mainly by Africans leading them into the Caribbean. And then a lot of gold is flowing into Spain from the Caribbean, from Mexico, and Portugal goes and gobbles Brazil, takes a lot of slaves into Brazil, into Ecuador, Venezuela, current day Peru, Chile, and makes or becomes a very big power and becomes a huge wealth. But the war that Portugal is fighting with Africans, particularly in Bahia and Palmares, weaken Portugal, and Portugal disappears as a major power. The slaves, make it disappear. After that, then you have Spain. Spain also goes into major wars. in the Caribbean, and major wars in the Americas. And Spain fights eventually a major war with Netherlands, with Holland. And this major war led to the center of power, shifting, from Spain and Genoa, to Holland. Holland becomes a major power simply because they have discovered the art of credit creation, of making money, by out of nothing, which is a system that banks use, which I've been talking about recently on our, social, media platform. So Holland fights a war with Spain, and this war leads to the destruction of Spain, and Spain, loses its power. Now, Holland becomes a major power, but it is tussling it out with France. Now, France will fight a war with Britain, but at the same time, France's GDP, like 80% of France's GDP, is coming from Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, 80%. And the Africans of Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture, like Peugeot and Dessalines, they defeat, the French army, Napoleon's army of the Pyrenees, commanded by Napoleon's brother Alec. But also, Napoleon launches major wars in Europe, and he gets a very thorough defeat in Russia, and he's eventually defeated by the British at the Battle of Waterloo. Now, the power shifts from Holland and France, and it goes to Britain. And Britain becomes a major power. The British pound becomes the currency of the global trade. It becomes the center of global capitalism. And by global capitalism, I mean merchant capitalism, commercial, which is the sale of goods, production capitalism, which is manufacturing and industry. And then corporation capitalism, which is mainly financial capitalism, which is banks, and corporation capitalism, which is multinationals. Now, Britain, leads this, and at the First and the Second World War leads to Britain fights major wars and faces major defeats. One of the memorable defeats that Britain suffers is the defeat by Africans at Isandlwana in 1896, where the Zulu army of Cetshwayo defeat the British at the Battle of Isandlwana.
The end of World War II, we had 50% of the world's gross domestic product. We were making 54,000 airplanes a year, 7,000 ships, et cetera, and we were the new Rome. And we recognized it and devised a power management scheme in the 1947 National Security Act to, we thought, manage it. And it worked fairly well during the Cold War. But we haven't done anything since, and I think that's another sign of our inability to grasp the new world, if you will.
Now, Britain, goes on to fight other battles in Africa, and in the Ashanti War, it fights in Nigeria, defeats the Sultanate of Sokoto. It fights, in Sudan with the Mahdi. It fights a lot of wars in India. But remember, when these countries are fighting these wars, they are not investing in their country. They are investing in warfare. At the time, this warfare was bringing a lot of goodies, because every time you defeated a country, you take almost everything. Britain fights a war with China, forces China to buy opium. To buy opium. The opium, which if you took to Britain now, you'd be arrested. But guess what? Britain was fighting a war with China, to force the Chinese to buy opium. China loses the war. When China loses the war, it leads, to China surrendering, not only paying reparations in terms of every coin of silver that was in China, but also China surrenders Hong Kong, which Britain will develop at the center of drugs trade. Cocaine, opium, everything that we think of now as obnoxious. That is what built Hong Kong. when you hear people talking about Hong Kong, they talk of Hong Kong in rosy terms and how Hong Kong is this and how Hong Kong, well developed by selling drugs. If you want to emulate Hong Kong, go ahead and sell drugs yourself. Now, all these wars weaken Britain. But the fundamental war Britain it would fight would be the war against America, where it loses its colony of America and all the wealth and resources that are coming from America. Remember, Britain was fighting its cousins in America. These are cousins to Britain. The thieves, the murderers, the whatever that had gone to America. The thieves and the murderers that had gone to Australia. To go to Australia in Britain, you had to be proven. You had to be proven that you are a murderer. You had to go to court, and the court certifies itself that yes, you have murdered somebody. That yes, you have committed armed robbery. That yes, so aggravated cases suitable for hanging, then they could send you to the Caribbean. Then they could send you to Australia. Then they could send you to New Zealand. Then they could send you to Canada. So the dregs of the British society were sent to America. And the dregs of British society were sent to, to Australia, New Zealand. But at this time, these were new lands with new resources. There were markets for British mercantile trade, for British capitalism. And Britain had also discovered from the Dutch credit creation. And once they have new credit creation, then they could make money out of nothing. And with the banks that they had set up, then they could fund most of these adventures.
This is called deficit spending. To pay for that deficit spending, the Treasury borrows current cut every step of the way. This isn't by chance, as you'll see shortly. Then, through a shell game called open market operations, the banks get to sell some of those bonds to the Federal Reserve at a profit. To pay for the bonds, the Federal Reserve opens up its big old checkbook and writes bad, bogus, counterfeit checks that should bounce because they're drawn on an account that always has a zero balance. There isn't one penny in there. To quote from the Boston Federal Reserve, when you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover that check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. The Fed then hands those checks to the banks, and at this point, currency springs into existence. The banks then take that currency and buy more bonds at the next Treasury auction. But what is a check? A check is also an IOU. When you write a check, you're making a note that says, here's my IOU for cash. All you have to do is go to the bank and pick it up. Now, it's very, very important that you understand this process because we're going to come back later and show you the devastating effect this has on you.
Now, when Britain wins the Battle of Waterloo, the center of capitalism moves to England. Now, at the First and the Second European Wars, major European wars, what they call a World War, in 1914 to 1918, 1936 to 1945. Some of you think it was 1940, it was 5 years. No, it started in 1936 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and with Italy's destruction of Ethiopia, at the Battle of Amber Aradan. So Britain loses control of the global, ceases to be a global superpower. Number one, it had faced a lot of destruction. Number two, it had lost a lot of money. Number three, it had lost a lot of men. And number four, it had lost its empire. Britain loses completely its empire. Most of the countries, fight to be free. Ghana goes this side. Britain is fighting a major war with Kenya. In Kenya, it is fighting in Zimbabwe. It is fighting in India. Pakistan is gone. India is gone. Most of the British colonies gain independence, and Britain hangs on to the Caribbean. And to keep itself in the center of power, Britain successfully creates what is called the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is nothing but a colonial institution, whereby the colonial leader ceases to have hands-on administration and instead goes in the background and elects African chiefs, i.e. our presidents, who then rule this country at British behest. That is why you see them obsessed with hosting CHOGM. That's why you see them obsessed with being recognized in the Commonwealth, taking part in Commonwealth CHOGM meetings and Commonwealth games, and Britain's giving scholarships for people to go and study in Britain. So Britain's hangover on capitalism is satisfied by the creation of the Commonwealth, where the Queen rules all the countries that she used to rule, but albeit, from the background.
With support from the CIA, Noriega was able to outmaneuver his rivals, and in August of 1983, he became commander of the Panamanian military. As the Reagan administration expanded its covert war against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, Noriega became increasingly helpful. Working with the CIA and with Israeli arms dealers, Noriega helped coordinate an arms supply network to provide weapons to Contra bases in northern Costa Rica.
Noriega's involvement in the drug traffic really increased his importance as a source for the CIA and as someone who was able to conduct dirty tricks in the region for the CIA.
But the torch now of global domination of capitalism is passed to America after the Second World War. And on the other side, the Soviet Union and the Soviet states. Now, with the advances of technological advances, particularly in the area of microchip, microelectronics, and telecommunications and communications, and the domination, of the dollar, America becomes a major power. One of the things that makes America a major power is that in 1945, at the conference, I think, when other countries are asleep, America, countries agree that American dollar becomes the reserve currency of the rest of the world. And once American dollar becomes the reserve currency, and how they did it was actually very clever, because they say, okay, we are not going to be the reserve currency technically, because you will need 32 ounces of gold for $1 American. So anytime you bring the gold, you bring the American dollar, we will give you the gold. So people say, fine, that's okay. It's not American dollar, it's just an expression. So American dollar becomes like a gold certificate that you'd be given if you deposited your gold. However, in 1971, the President of America takes America out of that Bretton Woods agreement where the dollar was backed by gold, and creates the dollar as a fiat currency. Fiat currency means it's a currency not backed by anything, it's just a piece of paper. It's really fiat means let there be. It's created out of nothing.
Ryland, your article is about how money gets created. We're surrounded here by gold in the vaults of the Bank of England, and historically in the gold standard, the amount of gold would have been related to the stock of money in the economy. Things are very different now. In the modern economy, where does money come from?
Well, let's start off with narrow or central bank money. As the name suggests, central bank money is determined by the Bank of England and consists of notes and reserves. And in normal times at least, notes and reserves are determined by the amount of notes that people want to hold or need for their transactions, and the amount of notes and reserves that banks want to hold given the level of interest rates in the economy. It is not chosen or fixed by the central bank, as is sometimes described in some economics textbooks.
Your article focuses on broad money. What determines how much of that there is?
Well, broad money, which in many ways is a better measure of the amount of money circulating in the economy, includes all the bank deposits of households and companies. And one of the key points of the article is that banks create additional broad money whenever they make a loan. Now, while this is nothing new, it is sometimes overlooked as the main way in which money is created, and it runs contrary to the view sometimes put forward that banks can only lend out deposits that they already have. In fact, loans create deposits, not the other way around.
Now, your article explains in more detail how lending creates money. It also explains how there are limits to how much banks are likely to create new money as a result of lending. These could be profitability considerations of the banks themselves, through to how households and companies react in aggregate to having increased deposits as a result of higher lending.
That's right.
So if banks create money through lending, what then is the role of the monetary policy of the central bank in this story?
Well, you mentioned some of the limits to how much banks will lend in practice. Well, monetary policy provides the ultimate limit. Now, in normal times, say before the Great Recession, monetary policy is set through interest rates, and that determines the loan rates that are faced by borrowers in the economy and the amount of interest that banks pay out to depositors. And this directly affects the amount of lending that goes on in the economy and the amount of broad money that's created as a result.
So obviously that's normal times. In the wake of the Great Recession, we've seen bank rate reduced to close to zero, and the Monetary Policy Committee embark on a series of asset purchases, often referred to as quantitative easing or QE, to stimulate the economy further. Now, your article discusses a number of myths relating to how QE affects the money supply. Now, QE serves to increase the number of reserves that commercial banks hold at the central bank. But the first myth you discuss is the idea that this in some sense represents free money for banks. What's wrong with that account?
Well, it's true, as you say, that QE will lead to an increase in the reserves that banks hold with the Bank of England. But if you consider what's going on the balance sheets of the parties involved, you can see that it's not really free money. The main point is that QE mainly involves buying government bonds from pension funds and other asset managers, not from banks. The pension fund in this example will receive money in their bank accounts, shown here in red, in exchange for those government bonds, shown in purple. The banks simply act as an intermediary to facilitate this transaction between the central bank and the pension fund. The additional reserves, shown in green, are simply a byproduct of this transaction. Now, while banks do earn interest on the newly created reserves, the key point is that QE also creates an accompanying liability for the bank in the form of the pension fund's deposit, which the bank will itself pay interest on. In other words, QE leaves banks with both a new IOU from the Bank of England, but also a matching IOU to consumers, in this case the pension fund. So in that sense, it's not really free money.
So in 1971, America comes off the the gold standard. Now, what had actually happened was America was involved in many wars, in Laos, in Cambodia, and in Vietnam. And because America was involved in most of these wars and had lost a lot of money, it found that whereas it owed the rest of the world about 35 billion US dollars worth of gold, it only had 15 billion or about 15 billion worth of gold. So it couldn't pay. So how does America solve this problem? America just comes off the gold standard and creates a fiat currency. A currency not backed by anything. Now, understand this. Every time I tell people that the American dollar is a piece of paper with graphics on it, and it's not backed by gold or any other thing, most people argue. They say, how can that be? I remember one head of a bank, of a central bank in one country, looking at me twice and say, what you are saying can't be true. Are you saying that the American dollar is not backed by anything? And I said, no, it's not backed by anything. And he says, but it's backed by the production of the American economy. And I said, that's nothing, that's rubbish. It means that if I want to produce chips, then the dollar strengthened. If a factory closed, then the dollar would go down. That is, it means that you can aggregate the entire production and say, now the dollar is backed by this. No. Currencies are backed by gold or silver. Gold maintains its standard. That's why you hear in a speech, when they say, well, that's the gold standard of economics, the gold standard of medicine, the gold standard of measurement, because gold is reliable as a measurement. So when America moves from the gold standard, American dollar becomes a fiat currency. Basically everybody who was holding the dollar was holding nothing. America performs what we call an economic swindle in 1971. But because currencies had been aligning themselves to the American dollar, most central banks, don't even think twice. They continue operating on the dollar. And then in 1973, Henry Kissinger performs one of the most dramatic acts any foreign secretary had ever done. And he persuaded Saudi Arabia to sell and mark and determine its oil in dollars. What is now known as the petrodollar. That's when you hear expression of a petrodollar, it means that Saudi Arabia had started accepting American dollars to pay for oil. Instead of gold, instead of British pound, instead of Russian ruble, they are saying, no, the dollar. Now understand this. Stop at home, stop what you are doing, and look at me and understand this. Imagine Saudi Arabia gets men and women and trucks and drills a hole in the ground and takes a variable resource called oil. In reality, it doesn't do it because it is the Americans that mine the oil. Now, after mining, imagine somebody sits in an office in America, gets a piece of paper, sends it to some graphic artist, he puts some pictures, and then prints millions of these and gives it to Saudi Arabia. That is what America does to us. It goes in one room called the Mint. It prints on pieces of paper graphics and other images, and then it sends them to us. America can sit in America in the Mint and print 1 trillion and come and buy the whole of Kampala. Now, what would they have taken? They have taken land, they have taken buildings, they have taken factories. In exchange for what? In exchange for pieces of paper with graphics on them. You only hope that while you are still holding them in your hands, they have value, so you can also go and give them to another person to give you what they give you. But once it collapses, it will not even be suitable for toilet paper. Now, America's 1973, the termination of oil or the sale of oil into American dollars really raises the value of the dollar, because everything, when humanity moves, from labor that was powered, by living things, or living capital, to go into labor that is powered by non-living, things. That is machines, like a steam engine. We then realize that when that happened, then, we had moved another step. The world had shifted. Those who remained using living capital or living energy found themselves at a disadvantage, because non-living energy like trains and factories that were now powered by coal or by not dragged by horses could produce faster. So America gets really a lease of life with the petrodollar, and that's why the relationship between America and Saudi Arabia is very strong. Because without Saudi Arabia, the dollar would not have become a dominant currency. So the SWIFT system that America uses now, to the world uses to pay, would not have been what it is if Saudi Arabia had not accepted. And that's why you see anybody who has stood up to interfere in the sale of oil in American dollars, America has taken out. That's what happened to Saddam Hussein the moment he decided that the oil should be sold in euros. That's what happened to Gaddafi the moment he decided that we create an American dinar. And by the way, I saw an interview recently with Gaddafi's son. And his son was saying that one of the biggest mistakes that Libya did was not to go into an alliance with Russia and to give up their weapons of mass destruction. Because once they signed an agreement with Britain, and they signed an agreement with France, and they signed an agreement with America, they thought they would never fight any war. Now, they had forgotten precisely what I'm saying, that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, America becomes almost the only superpower. And it wants now to control the resources of the so-called Middle East, particularly the hydrocarbon resources. America, at the same time, is controlling Europe and Japan and South Korea. And the reason they needed Europe, Japan, and South Korea was because Europe, Japan, and South Korea were producing new technologies. They were centers of new technologies. Most of the innovation that Germany comes up with, most of the innovation that Britain comes up with, of Japan, of South Korea, is really developed for the American economy and for the American infrastructure. So America became the superpower. It is dominating the whole world, and it is actually dominating Russia at the time, after 1991. Most of the books in Russia would have the picture of an American president. Most of the big companies, state-owned corporations, were sold, at the behest of the Americans, because the Americans were now advising Russia under a president called President Yeltsin, who was really a horrible president for Russia. And Russia was almost integrating until they get President Putin. Now, remember this, America is the only superpower. Its energy, it is seeking to control the energy sources, particularly the hydrocarbon, and other resources. At the time, it thinks it has got the resources of Russia, because Russia has got vast resources. Russia is a vast country, stretching over 6 time zones. It has got vast resources, and now America feels that once it controls Russia, then, it is case closed, because it will have no enemy, no challenger. However, America, in order to stay in existence, it needs an enemy. So this enemy they create, and that enemy becomes terrorism. Because they needed a permanent enemy. They had the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was gone. Russia was friendly. So what would they do? They needed another enemy, so they create 9/11, 9/11. And then they give themselves now a global terrorism. The terrorists can go anywhere. He can appear anywhere. They create Boko Haram. They create ADF. They create ISIS. They create all these. And they destroy any state that attempts to come, last one being Libya, because at the time, Russia was not speaking. President Medvedev, was really a European liberal. And significantly, America needs Japan, which has now moved to be the center of capitalism, because in America, capitalism is concentrated. It's concentrated mainly in the Wall Street, where, capital is concentrated in Wall Street banks, and stocks and shares. So in whatever area. That's why you see very big disparities. So many poor people in America.